I was contacted by a good friend the other day and they asked me if I had any leaf blowers I could sell them. And of course, I'm pretty sure you know what my answer was, but there was just one problem. I didn't have any good leaf blowers ready. And I only had one available to work on, but it's not what you would call a real blower, and it's more like a kid's toy. But as you're going to see here in just a bit, it had a lot of surprises in store for me to make up for its little size. In today's video, we're going to be looking at this Weed Eater brand leaf blower, and the problem is that it's been in storage for a very long time and now it won't start. It's very unfortunate that I have to work on this one, but it's supposed to go to a good friend of mine and their budget simply won't allow for a better brand. Now, I'm going to try and repair this blower, but yours might be a little different, so this might not work on yours. So if things aren't working out for you, like in the video, please ask about it. I'll be glad to answer your questions. I'm never going to make fun of you for using this blower, but there are much better blowers out there. However, when your budget is very limited, like most consumers today, you get what you can take. Now, one of the first issues I can see with this blower is the pull rope, and although it still works just fine, it's a bit crunchy and will need some attention. Now, this machine is not known for its durability, so I am a bit worried that after all this time, the engine might be a bit worn out. That means I want to do a compression test on the engine to find out just how worn out it might be. Now, the tester is going to measure how much pressure the engine can make, and the higher the better. But if we get a reading that's lower than expected, it just means the engine does have some wear on it. Now, the spark plug can tell us a lot about the engine, and right now, it doesn't show anything all that concerning about the engine or the fuel that it's been burning. So the reading is about 119 psi, which I hate to say this, is a lot lower than I was hoping for. And what that means is, this engine has a fair amount of wear on it, mainly on the piston ring or possibly on the cylinder wall. But there's still plenty of compression for the engine to start and run, at least that's what I thought. Next, I want to put some fuel into the carb and try starting it. Now, I'm going to say this out loud, but that was not very promising at all, and for those of you who know, that engine didn't sound right either. But it does confirm that the ignition system does work, and there is enough compression to allow the engine to start and run, but there's more going on with this engine that we'll find out later on. But right now, I want to put some fresh fuel into the tank, prime the fuel system, and then try starting it. And almost immediately we have a problem, which is that the purge bulb just broke on us, which means starting it will be a lot tougher than normal. So to try and avoid that, I'm going to remove the old one and replace it with a new one and then try that again. And unfortunately, this did not fix the priming issue with the fuel system because there's no fuel filling the bulb. So if your primer doesn't work to pull any fuel from the tank, it most likely means that your carb has an issue and needs to be replaced, or the filter in the tank might be clogged up. Either way, we need to take the carb off for an inspection and also take a look at the fuel lines and filter for any issues. Now, if you don't want to mess with the carb and just replace it instead, I won't blame you at all. Now, I've read through a lot of the comments and I've gotten some very colorful explanations about how replacing the carb should be your last resort. But what I have to say is, it's your machine, and if you want it fixed sooner than later, just replace the carb and avoid all the headaches. Now, the first diaphragm we looked at was the pumping diaphragm, and it looked great. However, this is the metering diaphragm, and it's supposed to help control fuel flow through the carb. But with it being a bit stiff to the touch, it's not able to do that, which means we need to replace this diaphragm. Now at this point, we also need to start taking out all the parts in the carb so that we can put it into the ultrasonic cleaner. Which means for this carb, we also need to take out the fuel adjustment screws. However, there is one serious catch. In order to take them out, we first need to find out where they were set at. We can do that by turning them clockwise until they stop. That way we can put them back in where we found them at. Now as you just saw, I had to turn the L screw a total of 2 full turns to get it to stop. That means when I put the L screw back into the carb, I'll turn it clockwise until it stops again, but then I'll turn it counterclockwise 2 full turns to put it back to where we found it at. Of course, this is assuming that the last person who made adjustments to the carb was someone at the factory and not someone else. But then again, having a place to start at is better than starting at some random spot, so I'll take these settings over my own guesses. So here's a quick tip. I like to keep the L screw on the left side of my magnet strip while I keep the H screw on the right side. This will help me to keep them organized so that I don't get them mixed up when I put them back on, but I'm not even sure if that's even possible. However, when it does happen, I will certainly let you know about it. So I'm going to run the cleaner for 2 cycles, and I'll be shifting the parts around for the second run. That should help out a lot. However, there's still a lot more work to be done right after they come out of the machine. Now the recoil assembly lives between the blower housing and the bottom of the engine, which means to get to it, we'll have to take the blower section off. Now it sounds more difficult than it actually is, and that's because the design of this blower is very minimal, so taking it apart isn't really that bad. There's just going to be a lot of screws we have to take out, but if you have a power tool, it'll make it a lot easier, but you will have to be very careful using it. Of course, the reason why is because the blower is mostly made out of plastic and not even the good kind either, so damaging it is really easy to do. Now, if you don't want to have to take apart the majority of your leaf blower to service the recoil, then I would recommend that you get a much better blower that has the recoil on the outside. Now, once we get the last of these screws off the machine, we'll then be able to separate the housing and then we'll be able to see the recoil. So here is the elusive recoil assembly, and right off the bat, I can see why it's acting the way that it is. I know it's a bit tough to see, but there is some rust visible on the backing plate under the pulley for the rope. And what that means is that the recoil spring has some surface rust on it, and that's the reason why it's acting the way that it is. Now, I could carefully take out the recoil assembly and then clean the spring and lubricate it to make it work better, but instead of doing that, I'm going to cheat a little bit and do it the easy way by cleaning it while it's still in the assembly. And to do that, I'm going to drill 2 access holes. That way I can spray the cleaner in one of the holes while the rust leaves through the other opening. Now, is this the best way to clean the spring? Nope, not at all, but it beats what I would have to do if I was going to do it the more conventional way. So as you can see, it's working quite well, and that's because you can now see the rust coming out of the openings after working the recoil after each application of the cleaner. Once that's done, I'll then spray a lubricant into the openings to lubricate the spring, and hopefully that'll keep it working well for the next couple of seasons. After that, we can then put the blower back together, and like I said earlier, if you're going to use a power tool, set the clutch to the weakest setting and be very careful you don't damage the plastics. Now of course you can test how the recoil is working while the blower is apart, but make sure you check how it's working after the installation of each part, not just at the end. The reason why is because you could make a mistake during the assembly that might interfere with the recoil, which has happened to me before. Oh, don't worry about mixing up the screws on the blower housing, they're all the same, so you don't have to keep them organized. Now once the blower housing is back together, we can now test how the recoil is working, and as you can see, it's much better and not all crunchy like it was before. Next, we can turn our attention to the fuel tank and replace the fuel line. However, there's one nasty surprise waiting for us that doesn't happen all that often. Now the fuel lines themselves are not in terrible shape, and to be honest, I had thought about not changing them, but I'm really glad that I did. Now after getting the fuel filter out of the tank and getting a better look at it, I soon realized that there was a buildup in the filter that was clogging it up. Now I've only seen this happen a handful of times, and if you're wondering how this even happens, it's because of prolonged contact with water in the fuel. Now I did end up throwing the filter into the cleaner for a cycle just to see if it would clean it out, but as you can tell, it didn't do much to it and mechanical cleaning will be needed. There's just one problem though. Even if I ran a wire through the filter, I couldn't guarantee that it wouldn't come back, so I'm just going to replace it instead. But if you are in a pinch and you can't replace it, you can take the filter apart and clean it. However, it's only a matter of time before it comes back. So it's at this point we can finally start to put the carb back together, but you'll need to be very careful when doing this because it's pretty easy to lose any of these tiny parts. So here's an issue for you. Most who would even consider taking on the task of trying to repair a blower would never go to the extent of taking the carb apart. So that's the reason why those that do will most likely end up just replacing the carb. And if you hadn't guessed it, that's also my advice to most people who want to try and fix their machine. Now once this carb is finally back together, we can now get to replacing those fuel lines, including a new fuel filter. Now for this particular blower, for some unknown reason, they decided to use 2 different fuel line sizes, but if I had to guess as to why, I'd have to say it was to save money. Now the way I found this blower, they had the larger fuel line set up for the fuel filter and the smaller line set up for the return, but you can do it however you want to. So yes, using the smaller fuel line for the filter line might restrict fuel flow capacity, but at the flow rates we're talking about, it won't affect it in a terrible way. So as you can tell, I cut off that angle piece that I made earlier so that I can install the plastic splice that they were using as a retainer to keep the line from coming out. But if yours didn't come with one, then you don't have to worry about it too much, and in its place, all you have to do is leave about an inch of fuel line in the tank. This will work well to make sure it doesn't come out over time. The last thing we need to do is to install the carb back onto the machine, reconnect the fuel lines to the carb, and then prime the fuel system for a test start, but that might be just a bit of wishful thinking. Now the filter line is the larger line and it will connect to the lower port on the carb, while the smaller line will connect to the upper port next to the bulb. So this is how the fuel lines connect on this particular carb, but they might be different for your model. Once that's done, we'll then add some fuel to the tank so we can prime the fuel system. So when pressing on the bulb, fuel should come up the larger line into the carb, into the bulb, and then leave the carb through the return line and then back to the fuel tank. And luckily for us, it looks like the fuel is flowing through the lines just like it's supposed to, which means we can now try and start the blower. However, if yours is not doing this, you'll need to go back through the carb and find out where there's an issue. Otherwise, you might have a blockage in the fuel filter or in the fuel line. Unfortunately, it's not starting and it's also not acting the way that it's supposed to, but I still want to try and add some fuel to the engine and see if that makes any sort of difference. Well, that didn't go very well at all. Unfortunately, I don't believe it's an issue with the carb or the rest of the fuel system that's keeping this engine from starting. That means I think there might be something terribly wrong with the engine, which is not what I wanted to hear. So now I have to figure out what's wrong with this engine, and I do have one possible answer which was shown earlier in the video during the compression test. And if you've made it this far, I think you might already know what the issue might be. Now I have to consider if I want to go through all the next steps because it's going to be a lot of work getting to what I think the issue might be. And unfortunately, if you're not sure what I'm talking about, you'll have to wait for the next video to find out. So my question is, after seeing how it's acting, what do you think the issue might be? And let me remind you, there are no wrong answers to this question. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.